Island. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 7th, 1878, the inhabitants of Ballycotton, County Cork, were greatly excited by the sudden appearance, far out at sea, of an island where none was known to exist. The men of the town and island of Ballycotton were fishermen, and knew the sea as well as they knew the land. The day before they had been out in their boats and sailed over the spot where the strange island now appeared, and were certain that the locality was the best fishing ground they had had. And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew. For the day was clear, and the island could be seen as plainly as they saw the hills to the north. It was rugged, in some parts rocky, in others densely wooded. Here and there were deep shadows in its side, indicating glens, heavily covered with undergrowth and grasses. At one end it rose almost precipitously from the sea. At the other, the declivity was gradual. The thick forest of the mountainous portion gave way to smaller trees, these to shrubs, these to green meadows that finally melted into the sea, and became indistinguishable from the waves. Under sail and oar, 100 boats put off from the shore to investigate, when, as they neared the spot, the strange island became dim in outline, less vivid in colour, and at last vanished entirely, leaving the wonder-stricken villagers to return, fully convinced that for the first time in their lives they had really seen the Enchanted Island. For once there was a topic of conversation that would outlast the day, and as the story of the island passed from lip to lip, both story and island grew in size, till the latter was little less than a continent, containing cities and castles, palaces and cathedrals, towers and steeples, stupendous mountain ranges, fertile valleys, and wide-spreading plains, while the former was limited only by the patience of the listener, and embraced the personal experience, conclusions, reflections, and observations of every man, woman, and child in the parish who had been fortunate enough to see the island, hear of it, or tell where it had been seen elsewhere. For the Enchanted Island of the west coast is not one of those ordinary humdrum islands that rise out of the sea in a night, and then, having come, settle down to business on scientific principles, and devote their attention to the collection of soil for the use of plants and animals. It disdains any such commonplace course as other islands are content to follow, but is peripatetic, or, more properly, seafaring in its habits, and as fond of travelling as any sailor. As its own sweet will, it comes, and having shown itself long enough to convince everybody who is not an innocent entirely of its reality, it goes, without leave-taking or ceremony, and always before boats can approach near enough to make a careful inspection. This is the invariable history of its appearance. No one has ever been able to come close to its shores, much less land upon them, but it has been so often seen on the west coast that a doubt of its existence, if expressed in the company of coast fishermen, will at once establish for the sceptic a reputation for ignorance of the common affairs of everyday life. In Cork, for instance, it has been seen by hundreds of people off Ballydonegan Bay, while many more can testify to its appearance off the bay of Courtmacsherry. In Kerry, all the population of Ballyhaig saw it a few years ago, lying in Tralee Bay between Kerry Head and Brandon's Head, and shortly before, the villagers of Lisnacarberry, just across the bay from Ballyhaig, saw it between the shore and Kerry Head, while fishermen in St. Finnan's Bay and in Ballinskelligs are confident it has been seen, if not by themselves, at least by some of their friends. It has appeared at the mouth of the Shannon, and off Carrigaholt in Clare, where the people saw a city on it. This is not so remarkable as it seems, for, in justice to the Enchanted Island, it should be stated that its resemblance to portions of the neighbouring land is sometimes very close, and shows that the enchanter who has kept it under a spell knows his business, and being determined to keep his island for himself, changes its appearance as well as its location in order that his property may not be recognized nor appropriated. Concerning the island itself, legendary authorities differ on many material points. Some hold it to be a real island, sure enough, and that its exploits are due to geometry or some other enchantment, while opponents of this materialistic view are inclined to the opinion that the island is not what it seems to be, that is to say, not of earth and stones like them as we see, but only a deluding show, that evil spirits, or the devil belike, makes for to deceive us poor dissolute creatures. Public opinion on the west coast is therefore strongly divided on the subject, unity of sentiment existing on 2 points only, that the island has been seen, and that there is something quite out of the ordinary in its appearance. On so deep and difficult a subject, an ounce of knowledge is worth a pound of speculation, and the knowledge desired was finally furnished by an old fisherman of Ballyconnolly Bay, on the Connemara coast, west of Galway. This individual, Dennis Moriarty by name, knew all about the Enchanted Island, having not only seen it himself, but, when a boy, learned its history from a ferryman, who obtained his information from the good people themselves, the fact stated being therefore, of course, of indisputable authority. What the fairies did not know concerning the doings of supernatural and enchanted circles being not worth knowing. Mr. Moriarty was stricken in years, having long given up active service in the boats and relegated himself to lighter duties on shore. He had much confidence in the accuracy of his information on the subject, and a glass of grog and a draw of the pipe brought out the story in a rich, mellow brogue. Faith, I'm not rightly sure how long ago it was, but it was a good while before the blessed St. Patrick came to the country and made Christians of the heathens in it. However, it was in those times that between this and Innismore there was an island. Some call it the Island of the Shades, and more say its name was the Soul's Repose. But it doesn't matter, for no one knows. It was as full of people as it could hold, and cities were on it, with palaces and courts and heathen temples and round towers all covered with gold and silver till they shone so you couldn't see for the brightness. And they were all heathens there, and the king of the island was the biggest of them. Sure he was Satan's own, and took delight in doing all the bloody things that came into his head. If the waiter that minded the table did anything to displease him, he'd out with a sword the length of me and cut off his head. If they caught a man stealing, the king would have him hung at once, without the taste of a trial, because, says the king, maybe he didn't do it at all, and so he'd get off, and so up with him. And so they'd do. He had more than 100 wives, generally speaking, but he wasn't much troubled with their nonsense. For when one was too talkative, or began complaining at him, he cut off her head, and said, by ways of a joke, "That's the only cure for a woman's tongue," and all the time from sun to sun, he was cursing and howling with rage. So as I'm sure your honour wouldn't want to hear me blaspheme the way that he did. To speak the truth of him, he was wicked in that degree that, asking your pardon, the old devil himself wouldn't own him. So one time there was a thundering argument in the king's family, for, remember, he had just about 100 wives. Now, it's my conceit that it's easier for 100 cats to spend the night under the same thatch than for 2 women to draw water by the same well without calling each other all the names they know. But when you've 100 wives, and more than 1,000 young ones, big and little, it's easy to see that the king of the island had plenty of use for the big sword he always kept handy to settle family disputes with. So by the time the row I'm telling you of was over, and the women stopped talking, the king had gotten angry 10 times, and he had only 90 wives left. So he says to himself, "Drat, I must recruit the force again, or them that's left will think I can do without them, and then there'll be no end to their impudence. Begorra, this marrying is a serious business," says he, sighing, for he'd got about all the women that wanted to be queens, and didn't know where to find any more. But by picking up one here and there, after a bit he got 99, and then could get no more, in spite of sending men to every quarter of Ireland, and telling the king's daughters everywhere how lonesome he was, and how the court was going to rack and ruin entirely for the want of another queen to mind the pantry. Not a woman could be had in all Ireland to come, for they'd all heard of the measures he took to keep peace in his family. But after trying everywhere else, he sent a man into the Joyce country, to a mighty fine princess of the Joyces. She didn't want to go at first, but the inducements were so strong that she couldn't hold out, for the king sent her presents without end, and said if she'd marry him, he'd give her all the diamonds they could get on a donkey's back. Now, over beyond the 12 pins in the Joyce country, there was a great enchanter that had all kinds of secrets, and knew where you'd dig for a pot of gold, all about the doctoring, and could turn you into a pig in a minute, and build a castle in one night, and make himself disappear when you wanted him, and take any shape he pleased, so as to look like a beast when he wasn't. Now to him went the princess, and asked him what to do, for she didn't care a drop for the king, but she'd give the 2 eyes out of her head to get the diamonds. The enchanter heard what she had to say, and then told her, "Now, my dear, you must marry the old fellow and have no fear, for if he dares to touch a hair of your golden locks, I'll take care of you and of him too." So he gave her a charm that she was to say when she wanted him to come, and another to repeat when she was in mortal danger, and told her to go and get married and get the diamonds as quickly as she could. And that she did. At first the king was mightily pleased with getting her, because she was hard to get, and gave her the diamonds and all she wanted, so she got on very well, and took care of the pantry and helped the other wives about the court. One day the king got up out of the golden bed he slept in a terrible sulk, and in a bad state of mind entirely, for the wind was in the east, and he had the rheumatism in his back. So he cursed and swore like a Turk, and when the waiter asked him to come to his breakfast, he kicked him into the yard, and the court went without him, and sat down at the table. So one of the queens brought him his bowl of stirabout, and then he found fault with it. "It's burned," said he, and threw it at her. Then Queen Peggy Joyce, that hadn't seen the temper that was on him, came from the pantry with a smile on her face, and a big jug of milk in her hand. "Good morrow to you," she says to him. But the old vagabond didn't speak a word. "Good morrow?" she says to him again, and then he broke out with a fury. "Hold your peace, you palavering strap. Do you think I'm about to be deafened with your tongue? Set the jug at the table, and be off with yourself, or I'll make you sorry you came," says he. It was the first time he ever spoke to her like that, and the Irish blood in her rose, and in a minute she was as mad as a gander, and as bold as a lion. "Don't you dare speak to me that way, sir," she says to him. "I'll have you know, I won't take a word of your impudence. My fathers wore crowns ages before your bog-trotting grandfather came to this island, and everyone knows he was the first of his dirty tribe that had shoes on his feet." And she walked straight up to him and folded her arms and looked him in his face, as impudent as a magpie. "Don't think to bully me," she says. "I come from a race that never owned a coward, and I wouldn't give you that for all the big swords you could carry," says she, giving her fingers a snap, right at the end of his nose. Now the old heathen never had anyone speak like that to him, and at first was as surprised as if a horse had begun to speak to him. No more could he say a word. He was that full of rage, and sat there opening and shutting his mouth, and swelling up like he'd burst, his face as red as a turkey-cock's. Then he remembered his sword, and pulled it out, and stretched out his hand to catch the queen and cut off her head. But she was too quick for him entirely, and when he had raised the sword, she said her charm that was to protect her, and before you could wink, there stood the blood-sucking old villain, mortified to stone, with his arm raised and his hand reached out, as stiff as a mast. Then she said the other charm and called the enchanter, and he came at once. She told him what she'd done, and he said it was right of her, and as she was a pretty smart woman, he said he'd marry her himself, and so he did. And being that the island was cursed by reason of the king's crimes, they came to Ireland with all the people. So they came to Connemara, and the enchanter got husbands for all the king's wives, and homes for all the men of the island. But he enchanted the island, and made it so that the bad king must live in it alone as long as the sun rises and sets. No more does the island stand still, but must go travelling up and down the coast. And every 7 years they see it in Kerry, and the next 7 years in Donegal, and so it goes, and always will be, by ways of a caution to kings, not to cut off the heads of their wives.